Greetings. My name is Mark Evanier, and I am very pleased to have this guest on here today. In the late 60s, around 66 and 67, there are fist fights still going on over what year it was. We started a club in Los Angeles called, brilliantly, the Los Angeles Comic Book Club. It met every Saturday at Palms Recreation Center, which is still over there on Overland Avenue in West LA, and I was the president of it. Rob Gluckson was the vice president. Rob Solomon was the secretary or the treasurer. Mike Rotblatt was whichever one Rob wasn't. We had a bunch of people in it: Bruce Schweiger, Steve Finkelstein, Bruce Simon, Barry Siegel. A lot of people, some of whom are still friends today, and some of whom haven't spoken to each other for reasons that flowed from the comic club. And one day, this fellow named Steve Sherman joined the group. With his brother Gary. I don't know how he joined or exactly when. We'll get to that. But we became good friends. Shortly after that, Steve and I were both hired by a company called Marvel Mania. We'll tell you about that. That was around in 1969. And some of you who sent money to Marvel Mania are probably still waiting for your posters and decal sheets. And shortly after that, Steve and I were hired as the assistants to this man named Jack Kirby. Steve, like me, feels a great obligation to talk about our time with Jack because we were witnesses to a very important time in the life of a very important man in the comic book industry. Probably the most brilliant guy who ever worked in the comic book industry, and certainly one of the people without whom there would not have been a comic book industry. So I invited my friend Steve, who I've now known for well over half a century, to join us here, and we're going to talk about what it was like to hang around with Jack Kirby and work with him. And Steve, come on in here now. Hello, my friend. How long have we known each other?
At least 50 years, probably 51, maybe even more.
Do you remember when you first came to the comic book club?
Oh, sure. It all came about because when Gary Owens did that show on Channel 13 about comic books, the history of comics, Gary and I saw that, and they showed Hollywood. They showed where the bookstores were. So we said, oh, let's go down there and take a look. So we went, and we went into Bond Street Books, and they had Guts, the fanzine that the Glucksons put out. And there's a little ad that said, Saturdays we meet at the Palms Recreation, blah, blah. So we lived in West LA. So we said, let's go. So one Saturday afternoon, we went there. And it was amazing. I liken it to not having been in a fraternity. This was our fraternity because, you know, I still know most of these people 50 years later. And, you know, we had a blast. We really did. When you think about it, how much fun we had. I mean, we made movies. We had the Evening of Imagination before there were Comic Cons. We insulted each other. We made fun of each other. We of course we read comics. I even remember the first time Sergio Aragonés showed up. He showed up at the Palms Recreation Center, and we were like, you know, wow, it's Sergio Aragonés.
How many people do you remember were in that meeting? Were at the club meeting that day?
God, maybe 20, I would think.
I thought it was more like 40.
Maybe 40. It's hard to remember.
Sergio remembers it being like 5 or 6 people, which I'm telling him no, it wasn't. We had a decent turnout for him that day. He was our first and I think only real guest speaker.
I think so. But well, there were 5 people crowded around him, so that's probably what he remembered. Just these folks. But let me clarify for people here what Steve was talking about. Gary Owens, the great disc jockey personality, did a show on Channel 13, KCOP local here, about comic book collecting. It was a special they did one evening, and it was a local station, but it somehow made us feel empowered because it was talking about our hobby, and it wasn't one of those, hey, look how much these old comics are worth shows, or there was a minimum of pow bam zap or whatever, and people are still looking for a copy of that. It's a lost special. Gary spent years calling KCOP saying, search the warehouse. You must have a copy of that someplace. Warehouse? I don't think KCOP had a warehouse.
I think KCOP was a warehouse, or is one now. So Steve and his brother Gary showed up at the meeting, and we met every Saturday in the afternoon, and we played games. We used to play a version of Jeopardy that I designed, which was like Jeopardy with comic book characters and comic book subjects. You know, it was like, I'll take Jack Kirby inkers for 20, you know, things like that.
Smash.
And we called the group also SMASH, which stood for Society for Magazine Appreciators of Superheroes. And I think I may have come up with that
Probably
in my stupider moments. But the club was a lot of fun for a couple of years there. And there were no Comic-Cons. There were very few Comic-Cons anywhere then, but none in California. This is pre-San Diego Con.
I think the only one was the Science Fiction Con in Santa Monica, which was the first one I went to.
That was the WesterCon.
Yeah, WesterCon.
The WesterCon was at the Miramar Hotel in Santa Monica in 1969. And that's where some of our members of the club met Jack Kirby, who would come down. Jack and Roz had just moved to Southern California. They were living in Irvine at the time in a home which was their temporary lodging until they could find a house to buy. And Jack wanted to meet the local comic fans, and this was the closest he could come to a convention. And he and Roz showed up there, paid admission, and walked in. And some of our officers who were at the club, I think Rob Solomon and Mike Rotblatt and Bruce Schweiger and such, met him there and said, "Oh, Mr. Kirby, would you come speak at one of our club meetings?" And he said, "Sure." He never did, but he said, "Sure. Why don't you guys come down to our house in Irvine one of these?" So that's how I wound up going down to see Jack Kirby. I met Jack Kirby the second Tuesday of July, 1969. We went down there, and Jack recommended me to work at this company called Marvel Mania that was in Los Angeles. It was not a part of Marvel. It was an outside company, if you can call it a company, that licensed the right to do mail order merchandise of Marvel comics. And can you imagine what that license would be worth today if he still had it? But the guy who ran it knew nothing about comics, knew nothing about honesty.
Knew nothing about marketing, knew nothing about merchandising. Although I will say this, the posters were gorgeous. When it came to printing, he went all out on that. But that was it. And that was about it. Yeah. And how much did they not pay you for your services? How much when they went out of business? How much did they owe you? Oh, geez. Well, I was not getting paid $2.50 an hour. So, but I was going to college at the time, so it was part time. I'd come in, in the after classes and do it. But nobody got paid. I mean, if we did get paid, it was every now and then. I think we'd get a check, but other than that, it was always like, "Oh, once we're on the way, guys, we're going to really be something." It was like, sure.
Okay.
But we were having fun. We were all there. We were, you were doing the magazine. We were doing the photograph stuff with Bruce as Dr. Doom. And, it was great. And then when we did the Toys for Tots thing, that really was something else. I mean,
the guy got the idea to promote his company somehow through Toys for Tots.
Well, because he was an ex-Marine, which I don't know how this guy ever was a Marine, but okay. I mean, he was about this tall and about this wide, But he also discovered that he could call people and tell them he was working for the Toys for Tots campaign for the Marine Corps, and ask them to donate things to him. Yeah.
Which he used for his own benefit. They didn't. People thought they were donating to Toys for Tots, and they were really giving him stuff.
Yeah. Now you and I put that thing together from the seat of our pants at the Pan Pacific.
Yeah.
I mean, we got the Three Stooges showed up. Clayton Moore showed up as the Lone Ranger. Ruth Buzzy. Did I say the Three Stooges? Yeah,
Three Stooges. Yeah.
And I think we were the only ones. CBS gave us a print of Charlie Brown's Christmas, which you couldn't see any place else, and we had a 16 print of that we showed. Yeah. But remember, up until that point, not Baby Daphne, but who was the other one?
Hobo Kelly.
Hobo Kelly had the Toys for Tots thing, and
Hobo Kelly was a local kids show host.
Right.
in Los Angeles. She was on Channel 11,
9.
I think, or 9. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, Baby
And
Daffy was on 9. Hobo Kelly,
right.
I think, was on
It
11.
was 11 and 13, I think, at one point. But
Yeah.
she had
Hobo Kelly was married to the stage manager, the lady who played her.
Yeah.
She was Sally Baker, and her husband was Walt Baker, and he was like the general manager of the station or something.
Yeah, but she got all pissed off that they switched from her to the Marvel superheroes as the Toys for Tots. She was not happy with that. I think she had her own parade or something after that. But that was fun. That was fun.
Yeah. Now, Steve, there's about 8. We could fill hours with stories of working at Marvel Mania. But
True.
One thing I wanted to, I need a witness for this, and you're my witness. Okay. All right. I have told people that one of the 83 reasons that company went under is that the boss became enamored of the idea and put all of his energy and money into another project, which was to rebuild ancient Rome.
That's right. Rome, BC, to be built.
Rome, BC, yes. He had this idea. He was going to rebuild the Colosseum in Italy as an amusement park.
But what he was going to use were the sets from some big Spanish production, some Italian film that had all these sets. And we tried to tell him, say, but, you know, those things are made of cardboard and wood. There's nothing behind it. He wouldn't hear it. Remember, he had on his fake desk, he had all these soldiers and stuff all lined up. And one day I accidentally knocked them all over.
These little toy soldiers, yeah.
Yeah, so he was like, I got to rebuild Rome, BC. You don't have 10 cents. How are you even going to get to Rome?
Well, he managed to put it on credit cards and never paid them off. He was very good at avoiding creditors. But at one point, remember one night, he turned to me. You know, the whole problem with Marvel Mania was that the money that came in to order posters and decals and things never quite equaled the manufacturing costs. So he was always behind. He was always in arrear, and orders were not getting filled because he didn't have the money to make the merchandise.
No.
So it was kind of like, we're waiting. You know, we've got a lot of people have ordered this item, and we're waiting for him to have enough money to make them. So for months are passing, and people are writing in angry letters. And then one day, while he was trying to rebuild Rome, BC, he comes up to my little desk, my little cubicle, and he says, "What movie studio made Ben-Hur?" And I said, "That was MGM." And he said, "Why didn't you tell me?" MGM was auctioning off the back lot at that time. They're selling, had a sale going on of all their props and costumes and things around. And he grabbed up all the cash that had come in that day to order Marvel Mania merchandise, went out, hailed a cab because he didn't have a car, couldn't afford a car, and he took the cab to MGM and started buying costumes for for his Rome, BC plan. And he was being bid against by Debbie Reynolds, buying stuff for
her museum.
You remember all this, right, Steve?
Oh yeah, sure.
Yeah. He was buying stuff for. She was buying stuff for the Hollywood Museum that she always wanted to build, and she was bidding against him. So he took her aside, and he said, "Listen, if you'll let me buy this stuff and you won't bid against me, I'll copy it all, use the copies for my purposes, and donate the originals." And she went, "Okay." So she stopped bidding against him. He got all this stuff. He spent all the Marvel Mania money that wasn't going to be used to print posters to buy these cheap costumes, which looked fine on the screen, but if you looked up close up, they were
falling apart.
They were falling apart. And he was walking around the office for several days wearing a Roman soldier breastplate. And he had, you mentioned his fake desk.
Yeah.
His fake desk was not a desk, it was a box. He couldn't afford a desk, so he bought some wood paneling like you'd use to panel a den, and he just nailed it into pieces. So he had this box he'd sit, it looked like a desk from the front. And if you asked him to, you got a pen? If a visitor asked him for a pen, he'd lean down, pretend he was pulling a drawer. There were no drawers in the thing, and he'd pick the pen off the floor, and then he'd mime closing the drawer that wasn't there. And Anyway, after a while, we got fed up with how badly he wasn't paying people, how badly he
Yeah.
was stiffing kids. And one day he says to us, he'd booked a ticket to Rome. He says, we went to him, we said, you got to fill these orders. You've got to do something about this. You've got to stop putting the money into this Rome thing and fill these orders, or nobody's going to ever buy anything from Marvel Mania again, which at that point, maybe they weren't anyway.
Yeah.
And he said, I'm going to Rome tomorrow, and when I get back, we're going to do a new mailing, and we're going to offer new merchandise to the kids, and they'll order that, and I'll use that money to make the old merchandise we haven't made. So that night, you and I went out to dinner, and we talked about this. And we said, we got to know more about this guy. So we went back to the office after hours. He'd given me a key. I think you had a key too. And we went through all the files. Remember that night?
Oh, yeah.
We figured out how much in debt this guy was, and how many different names he'd been operating under, how many different companies.
Uh-huh.
We also, do you remember the photos we found of him?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
There were photos of him with naked women.
With Ushi Dagard.
Ushi Dagard, who was the most photographed woman in men's magazines at that time.
Uh-huh.
And he had shot her for a proposed plan that had fallen apart to do 3D posters of her.
Right.
He had these two women with huge breasts, and he couldn't resist when they were there taking a bunch of pictures of him fondling them. And we momentarily thought of mailing those to his wife, but thought better of it.
Yeah.
So that night, the next morning, we made up a list of all the people that Marvel Mania was going to stiff for money, and we took turns. We divvied up the list, and you called half of them, and I called half of them, and told them, "This guy's never going to pay you. Get out of this if you can. He's a crook. We're quitting."
Mm-hmm.
And I quit before he came back. You stayed on another week or two to fill whatever poster orders you could.
No,
and then you quit.
I quit first because you stayed to finish the magazine.
I thought it was the other way around.
No, you had to finish the magazine. And I went in there, and he was taking the money out of the envelopes and putting it in his pocket. And I gave it to him. I said, listen, you can't blah, 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 blah. And he said, get out of here. Don't you ever come back again. He's through. And I left. And then you were there for another, I forget how long, but you had to finish up that issue of Marvel Mania magazine. Then you left.
Yeah.
That because you knew if you left it, it was never going to get printed.
Yeah.
And then what happened is those other guys came in and they threw everything you did out in the trash and did their own version of it, which, it got printed, but.
And then a few months later, Marvel closed him down and he disappeared.
He disappeared. Well, I think it was Barry Siegel went there one morning to go into work, and because he was one of the few guys that stayed. There was a whole new group of ex-Comic Club guys who stayed there, and he came in, and the place was locked, and he looked at it, it was empty. Everything was gone. The sheriff had locked it, had put a note up there, and so he went over to his house, to the guy's apartment, and he was gone. Everything he had moved. And we think he moved to Sweden or something. He was something else.
I ran into him on Santa Monica Boulevard. I was driving, and he was driving the other way. We stopped, our car stopped, and we glared at each other and then kept on going. Months later, but we never heard of him since then.
No,
but in the meantime, before that, there was this strange day while he was out of the country, while we looked up, we were out to go to lunch, and Jack and Roz Kirby walked in. And they asked if they could take us to lunch, because I met Jack that day in '69, and then I took you down to his house once or twice in Irvine, and then we went to see him in Thousand Oaks after they moved. Mm-hmm. We become friends with them, and they were impressed with A, how much we knew about comics, B, how hard we were working on stuff for Marvel Mania, and how well some of it was coming out of what did come out. Jack understood completely what was wrong with the company and the guy there. And they said, where can we go to lunch? And I said, Cantor's Delicatessen. and we went to Canada's Delicatessen, and Jack had potato pancakes. I remember that. I don't know why I remember that, but he ate potato pancakes with his hands, like the traditional way. And he said to us, well, I'm talking too much. You tell the story of what happened that day.
You remember it better than I do because my memory is shot. But I think he talked to us about how he was going to go to, I think that's when he told us he was going to DC. And we were like, how can you do that? You Jack Kirby, you're at Marvel. You can't go to DC. He says, yeah, I'm going to DC. I'm quitting. And they're going to give me all this stuff. And I'm going to need some help. And I'd like you guys to come and help me. And we were like, well, sure. We didn't ask what he was going to pay. We didn't ask anything. We just said, sure. So that's when we started. And we went up to visit him at the house, and that's where he showed us all the New God stuff and Mr. Miracle, all that presentation art that he had. And we were just floored. We were just wowed by it. Just went like, whoa, this is amazing.
Yeah, we had to sit on that secret for about a month.
Yeah.
And there came a day when he told us we could tell a few people, and nobody believed us. Nobody thought. And then, let's see, at what point did we go to New York? Well, that was Jack hired us in February of 1970. He quit Marvel in the second week of March 1970, and his comics didn't come out until late 1970. But we went to New York for the July 4th weekend that year in 1970. Right. And we were still working for Marvel Mania at that time.
Yeah, right.
Shortly after that. And you and I went back to New York. We stayed at the Statler Hilton Hotel. And the idea was we went back a week before the 1970 July 4th Phil Suling convention. It wasn't called the Phil Suling convention, but Phil ran it, and everybody informally called it the Suling Con. And so we went back on a Sunday. And on Monday, we went to DC Comics offices, because we were Jack Kirby's assistants, and we met Carmen Infantino and Julia Schwartz, and Neil Adams, and Joe Orlando, and Murray Boltonoff, and all those people.
Mark Hannerfeld.
That's the day I first met Marv Wolfman and Len Wein. We went and sat with them in the coffee room. Right. And Saul Harrison, who was the head of production, sat us down. You remember this? He sat us down and he said to us, if you have any influence with Jack, see if you can get him to try to draw more like Kurt Swan. we really don't like square fingertips or some of those weird things he does with the bodies. And you and I looked at each other like, I think that was our first inkling that things were not going to go well for Jack at DC.
Yes. We became aware that,
yeah,
not everybody's thrilled.
Yeah, not everybody's thrilled to have the Marvel guy there, because they had kind of taken the position that Marvel comics all stunk. And
as I got older, I realized that they were afraid. They were afraid of their jobs. These are guys that had been there since the 40s, and they were stuck. And at any point at that time, they were talking about shutting down DC. They were going to just do reprints, and they were scared to death that they were going to lose their jobs, because they were only at that point, maybe in their late 50s, I think. Maybe
some of them were younger than that.
Yeah. So,
but it wasn't just that Steve. It wasn't just that they were scared that DC was going to shut down, but the company had gone over this enormous turmoil where Erwin Donenfeld, who was the editorial director and the son of the owner of the company, was fired. And they fired a lot of editors, and they fired a lot of freelancers.
Yeah.
Most of the guys who worked for Mort Weisinger on the Superman books had been told their services were no longer needed, because Wayne Boring was gone, and Jim Mooney was gone, and George Klein was gone, and George Papp was gone, and Pete Costanza was gone. Yeah. And they'd fired this editor, George Cashton. And so Murray Boltonoff, who'd been like his partner, was going like, oh, I survived, but George is gone. And while we were there, Mort Weisinger turned in his last issue of Superman. We actually, I don't know if you were with me at the moment, but I was introduced to Mort Weisinger.
No, I never met him.
At one point there, one of the moments we were separate there, and Mort Weisinger, who could have cared less about meeting me, was just there because the last issue of Superman he was editing, after being there since the Cro-Magnon era, was going to press, and he signed off on to go to press, and he was done with DC, and he walked out the door for the last time, probably. And so the company was like, it's like nobody was ever where they were before, and
No.
people were gone, and Carmen Infantino was now running this place, and I never got the feeling he had the total confidence of anybody up there, but he was the guy in charge. So anyway, so we went to Marvel, the DC the first day. The second day, we were supposed to go over and have a meeting with Stan Lee at 10 a.m. So we got up that morning, and we got dressed. We went down and had some breakfast. We were back in the room at 9:15, getting ready to go to Marvel at 10. And the phone rings, and it's Stan's secretary saying, he's got a meeting, come at 3 o'clock.
Mm-hmm.
For this. So we had suddenly nothing to do in New York, and I hadn't been to New York since I was 9, so we just went sightseeing. We walked around New York, and at one point, we're walking down Madison Avenue. Stop me if you don't remember any of this, or if you do. And we suddenly hear someone yell, "Mi amigos!" We look across Madison Avenue, and catty corner on the corner is Sergio Aragonis.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And we walked over there, and I was amazed. He spotted us across one of the busiest streets in the world, and that he remembered us, because I didn't know Sergio that well, and you'd met him even fewer times than I had at that point. And he said, "What are you doing in New York?" And I said, "Well, we're here for the Celine convention, and we were supposed to go have a meeting with Stan Lee, but he had to postpone it. So we're just kind of wandering around New York." He says, and he said to us, "Are you going to visit the Mad offices while you're back, Mad Magazine offices?" And we said, "Gee, we haven't thought about that. Where are they?" And he said, "Right here." He was standing in front of them. So he took us in and gave us a tour. And on the way in, we passed this little sad-faced man who was leaving with an art portfolio. And I went, "That's Wally Wood. What's he doing here?" And he took us in, and we met Al Feldstein and Jerry DeFuscio and Nick Meglin and Bill Gaines and Leonard Brenner and John Putnam, and Angela Torres was there. And we got this grand tour of Mad Magazine we hadn't counted on.
Yeah.
And then at 3 o'clock, we went over and met Stan.
Yeah, that was something.
What do you remember? What do you remember from the meeting with Stan?
I just remember it was a very, very small office. I was surprised. Marvel Mania had bigger offices than Marvel had. It was just like the front room had the tables, and I think Johnny Romita was there, and Marie Severin was there, and maybe one other guy was there.
Herb Trimpe and Tony Mortallero were there.
Yeah.
And a guy named Alan Brodsky was working there as an editorial assistant. In the back was John Verpoorten and Roy Thomas and Stan's secretary, whose name escapes me at the moment. And they took us in to meet Stan.
To Stan.
Remember the first thing he said to us?
No.
He said to us, "I've been so busy these days, I haven't had a chance to look at the comics lately. If you asked me what was going on Iron Man this month, I couldn't tell you." We understood that meant don't ask me about any.
Don't ask me about comics. Yeah. Don't ask me comic book stuff. But yeah, then we told him about Marvel Mania and all that, and he was like, very concerned. He said, "Well, I'll look into it," because we said, this guy's going to give you a bad name if you keep going with him. And he was like, no, he was very personable. He was wonderful. He was Stan Lee. I mean, what more could you ask for?
Very charming.
And, very charming, and he was great to us. And he said, "Give my regards to Jack," and when you see him, and he said, "Thank you." And we left. The only other place I remember, we went to Warren. We went to the Warren offices, and we went up there and looked around there for a while.
We went to visit Steve Ditko.
That's right. We visited Steve Ditko.
Spent a day with Steve Ditko.
We did. That was wild, because he was so nice and so ordinary and so open, and we were going like, I thought he was supposed to be like this recluse, but no, he was just he was a sweet man, and you just go like, well, there you go. Can't always believe what you hear.
Anyway, and then a couple days later, Mike Reuter joined us.
Yes.
He flew into New York, and he stayed with us, the three of us in the hotel room, and we sat up all night telling dirty jokes, and not sleeping.
No. Well, it was exciting. I mean, my God, that convention was the biggest one I'd ever seen. And you looked out, there was a balcony, and you looked out on the main floor, and there's miles, just like comic books and original art. I had never seen so much original art in my life, just stacks of it. And I was just like, where did this come from? Because, you know, all I'd ever read in the fanzines and stuff was, oh, it's all been destroyed. There's no more original art anywhere. And, you know, they burned it. And then here it was like, oh, it's original art. You just go.
Well, you know,
and it was very expensive, $10 a page.
Yes. Yeah. Somebody brought in every page of Tower original art, every single page that was in the Thunder Agents comics, and they put it on the table, $10 a piece, and it looked like a white sale at Macy's. Flipping through it and going, you know, where's the wood? Where's the wood? Where's the Gil Kane? You know, were you with me? I was in the elevator at one point, and there was a slightly older gentleman, an adult, and he was taking a couple of fans up to his room to show them artwork. Mm-hmm. And I somehow got in the conversation, and he said, yeah, you want to see my artwork? And I didn't know who he was. He didn't have a badge on. But I said, sure. I figured out maybe if I saw his artwork, I knew who he was. And he takes us into this hotel room, and he takes the photo, he starts pulling out Frank Frazetta paintings. And I go, oh, Mr. Frazetta, this is Frank Frazetta.
Oh.
It was a very strange couple of days. I met my friend Marty Pasco and Alan Brenner there for the first time, and I met Gary Groth there. I met Tony Isabella in person. We've been corresponding. Tony, you know, is still been my friend for a long time. I met him there that day. We actually had it was amazing. I met like everybody whose comic books I ever read in my life.
Mm-hmm. And we flew on a 747. Which was you can't do anymore.
But remember, we flew on the second 47 of the day. The first one left without us. There was a guy, I'll see if you remember this, Steve.
Probably not.
A guy who was taking his family, and he was so proud they were going to 747. So he was making a little movie. He had an 8mm camera. And he's making a movie, and he shows them arriving, coming up. He says, makes them do several takes of arriving at the gate, and he's, you know, getting their tickets and things like that. And then he has them sitting down. He goes, okay, go over there and sit down like you're waiting for the flight. And then he's shooting. At one point, discovers he's shooting the plane taking off, and suddenly realizing that he's not on it. But his dog is. They put their dog on the plane, and he's running around ranting, yelling, "My dog's on the plane! Bring it back!" Anyway, but it was a very
that was a fun trip.
That was a very fun trip. Yeah, we had a great time. So when we came back, we started working with Jack. Now I have some questions here. Actually, I need to hold on here. Don't go away.
No.
Come to yourself for a second here.
I'm in quarantine. I can't go anywhere.
Okay, I'm looking at my email. I can't see you right now because I'm opening my email up here. John Morrow of the Kirby Collector sent me a pile of questions to ask. Here. I told him we were going to do this interview. And questions for Steve Sherman and you.
Okay.
Did you and Steve arrive at Jack's together every day on specific days of the week, or only when Jack called you in? Answer, I didn't drive then, so Steve picked me up and we drove out there together.
We usually go out on a weekend, on a Sunday. Sometimes we go during the week, but usually it was on a Sunday, and we go there. But yeah, sometimes during the week. But we'd also meet during the week at work. You know, we'd go to your house and we work on stuff. I mean, because one of the first things we started working on was the Kirby Unleashed portfolio, and that, you know, we worked long and hard on that. So that was one of the things that we were working on, and we'd go out. You know, we interviewed Jack. Big long interview. Then we also went over the stuff we wanted to put in the book, and that's when, you know, he showed us his closet full of originals, you know, all the artwork. I have that picture of you sitting there going through all that stuff. And so we did that. Yeah, then we started, you know, then we'd work on the comic stuff. But yeah, we'd go out there together. Yeah.
Okay. Next question. What was Jack's own work schedule like when you worked for him? If he worked at night and slept late, like I've heard over the years, did you see him actively drawing when you were there, or did most of the drawing take place when you left for the day? We saw him actually drawing a lot. Actually.
Yeah, because he would start and stop. You know, he would. I mean, the bulk of it he would start at night, but then during the day, when he had time, he'd sit down and keep going, and then stop, keep going. Uh-oh, 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 it's Froggy the Gremlin! Oh, no, it's Froggy the Gremlin! Vince Coletta was the best inker. Get out of here. Send him.
My recollection is that Jack would start work around 11 in the morning or so, and he would work till like 4 in the morning or something like that. He worked till Roz came in and said, "Come to bed, Kirby," and drag him off, and Jack would go, "One more panel. Let me do one more panel here." But yeah, we saw him drawing. He didn't draw as well when he was conscious someone was looking at him.
No.
Whenever time Jack had to do a chalk talk in front of audiences, he forgot how to draw.
Yeah, no, because really the drawing wasn't that important to him because it came so naturally that it was the story and the pacing and everything else that was going on in his head. The drawing, he didn't have to think about that. So if he wasn't thinking about the story and just drawing, it was kind of like, gee, okay, sure, I can draw this. But really, I mean, he just drew so organically that it was the story and the characters and, how to pace it all that it was going through his head rather than how do I draw a car? How do I draw the building? The building just took shape. I mean, it was just, there's the building. Here's the figures.
I tell people that when Jack erased art, and he did that a lot, it was never because the drawing was bad, it was because it was wrong. He decided he should have drawn something else in that spot, or there was a better way to stage that scene.
Right.
He never erased and redo the scene better. He would draw it from another angle or draw something different happening in it.
Yeah.
And occasionally we erased panels for him. He'd hand us a page and say, "Take out those 2 panels," and we would go, "What? Can't we cut them out and save them?" Because they were amazingly, wonderful. It was all wonderful artwork. And we did a little work here and there. I remember drawing the Superman emblem on him for a few times, and a couple times having to correct a balloon that didn't make sense. He left a word out or spelled something wrong. And there was that one page I wound up writing in a Mr. Miracle story. But yeah, okay, next page, question here. What was your daily routine at Jack's place? Did you and Steve have different respective responsibilities, or did Jack just hand you stuff to do as it came up?
We discuss it. We'd sit there and he'd tell us what he wanted, what he was looking for, and then he'd let us go. He'd say, here's what I need, a page, or I need you to write this story that's going here for the, in the Days of the Mob or in the Spirit World stuff. He said, this is what I need. We'd go, okay. We'd go off and do it and bring it back.
Yeah.
I mean, he never, was on us to do stuff. It was just, here it is, guys. Go do it. Bring it back. We'll do the next thing.
And whatever we brought him, he would say, "This is great. This is terrific. You guys did a great job." And then he'd use very little of it, or none of it,
or do something. But it was enough that he had something to start with, which helped him, I guess. Not that he needed help.
Okay. What were your interactions with Roz and the Kirby kids and other fans that visited? Did you guys relax and take a swim now and then, or only a get-togethers outside of work like July 4th?
Mostly on July 4th, we'd go in the pool. I mean, we wouldn't come out there and fool around. I mean, we were out there to work. But no, we became very close with Roz and the kids. I mean, I'm still friends with Neil and Lisa and, the grandkids. So, no, it became like family.
We go to dinner with them or lunch.
And 4th of July.
Where they'd barbecue.
Yeah.
We used to barbecue sometimes.
And then we'd go watch fireworks at the park. We'd all get in the car.
Yeah.
We'd go watch fireworks. Jack would sit there, or he'd actually stand there with a cigar and just watch the fireworks. And he was writing about 4 comics at that point. He was gone, he was just like, okay. Then we'd go back and he'd just start on a story, Fireworks would inspire him.
I think we should tell the story, never before told anywhere, of Maxine and Alice.
Oh, Maxine and
You remember
Alice.
Maxine and Alice?
Was that the photograph of the
That
two
was
girls?
the photograph,
yeah.
We get this letter. We were handling the letter pages, and the letters went to Jack's P.O. box. So Jack had the mail, and we go in, and Jack says to us one day, "Take a look at the mail, guys. There's a letter there you're really going to appreciate." And it was a picture from 2 ladies named Maxine and Alice, no last names, no return address, and they had taken a photo of themselves naked, reading New Gods and Forever People, having the photos in front of their faces, and the rest of them were like Hustler magazine poses. And the letter said, "Your comics make us swollen. Come get it. We really love you." And I remember we looked at it, and Jack said, "Now those are fans. Those are real fans."
And then Rod said, "Kirby! Kirby!"
Yeah, and Jack ended up burning the photos, so he didn't want to listen to them.
She made him. Ross made him. She said, "Get rid of that, Jack. Don't you show that to the boys."
We put a little note on the letter page. Thanks to Maxine and Alice, a couple of swell girls.
Yeah.
All right, back to the questions here. How much were you paid by the hour or a flat rate per week, and did your weekly amount of work vary? The amount of work varied. What we got paid varied. We just kind of told Jack, "Pay us whatever you want, whenever you want," and I never felt cheated ever in that entire time.
No, he paid us well for what we did.
But you remember, he would write you. Roz would make out a check for us. He'd make out one for you and one for me, and Jack would take your check and he'd sign it, and he'd hand me my check unsigned. Said, "Here, you do my signature." I'd actually forge his name on this. Because I signed a lot of his stuff. He had me signing fan mail at one point. So
no, you did an excellent Jack Kirby signature.
Yes, but
also everybody else too. I mean, you could do them all. You did Wally
I
Wood.
used to be able to do that. I used to be able to. I used to imitate your handwriting on a couple of things.
Yeah, no, you were great at that.
Very strange. Did you overhear any key phone calls with DC and specific plans for a DC West? Well, we heard plans about opening a DC office on the Warner Brothers lot, which they kind of have now. DC Comics is now, a stone's throw from Warner Brothers. But at the time, that was like a talked about thing, and Carmine kept saying he wanted to do it. And they didn't want to do it. They didn't want to lose that. They didn't want to abdicate that power.
No. Harrison and Adler, they were not going to have that.
No.
No, they were.
Yeah. No, we heard over a number of conversations. There was an issue of Carmine would send out proofs of covers, not just necessarily Jack's, but proofs of other covers, and Jack would tell him why he didn't like them. And Carmine was always shocked that he kept telling Carmine the covers are full of death, the colors are full of negativity. Yeah. There was a cover on Strange Adventures showing a nuclear holocaust, and it said, like, which country will blow up the world or something like that. It was Joe Kubert cover, and Jack was furious about it. He thought that was a terrible thing to put on a comic book, and a non-commercial thing to put on a comic book.
Yeah.
And I remember him kind of chewing Carmine out for it on the phone. And there was this cover that Neil Adams did for a thing called The World's Greatest Superheroes. It was a special. It was like a mob scene of all the DC superheroes standing, with their fists on their hips posed. And Jack didn't like the cover. Carmine thought it was the greatest cover ever done. And Jack says to him, "These are action heroes. You've got them all standing around doing nothing. Yeah. And they're all in the same pose, and they all have the same physique, and the colors on the cover stink." He hated the coloring.
Oh, yeah. Oh, which just made, Adler very happy.
Those were brutal calls.
Yeah. Well, Jack really hated the ones where somebody would be holding the superhero like this, and they'd be draped in their arms, dead. Jack would just be like furious, going like, "What is that for a cover?"
Yeah. Remember how we redid Mr. Miracle's coloring?
Yes.
And he had to fight to get that in. Steve and I did the coloring for the Mr. Miracle suit because he hated what they had done for the first issue. He was the editor of the book, and they sent it to him for approval, and he said, "I don't approve." And they said, "Well, we're printing it anyway."
Yeah, right.
Had a big fight with them over that. He didn't like any of the colors in the books at all.
Because that was the time they were experimenting. I think, isn't that when Neil Adams showed them how to do more colors and they could gray down everything? And so they started graying everything down instead of popping it up. Because I know Jack was always saying the three best colors are blue, red, yellow.
Yeah. He said he said every DC comic is colored like it's a war comic.
Yeah.
And I think that was right.
He
but
is,
when he told,
they
when he told them that when he told them that he thought Maurice Severin was the best colorist in the business, they thought he was crazy. Yeah, he kept fighting with them a lot. Let me go back to John's list here. Jack must have had an initial master plan for the Fourth World's evolution, or stories like The Pact and Hyman wouldn't have worked so well midway through it. Do you recall him discussing any long-range plans with you early in its production? Yeah, well, tons of those things. Yeah. Tons of those things, and he didn't follow half of them.
No, and he also wanted to have other people do it. He just wanted to get them going and have other people come in and write and draw them. I mean, he wanted to, have a line going, but they were like, no. We're paying you top dollar. You're not going to hand this stuff off to anybody else.
Do you remember, like I mentioned this on one of the recent podcasts I did here, how Jack suggested to Carmine that DC get the rights to Captain Marvel, bring back Shazam?
I remember that. We were in his house when he told us that. Yeah. We were in his studio and he was telling us.
We had that meeting with Carmine down at the convention downtown in L.A., and we talked about it some more, and I gave him C.C. Beck's phone number, which I'd obtained, and Carmine went off, and the idea was Jack was going to edit it, and we were going to do something on it, write it or supervise or whatever. And the next thing we knew, they took it away from Jack in New York.
Oh, so, sure, of course.
Yeah, he was pretty upset about that. Yeah. Was Jack doing any work outside of DC at the time that you helped him with, advertising work, magazine illos, etc.? I remember the card games for Mattel.
Right.
Which we worked on. I actually drew Jack. I did the Superman emblems and Jack's signature on those. Mike Royery. And then they sent them to Mattel, and Mattel loved them. And Mattel had to send them back to DC for approval, and they came back with Murphy Anderson heads on them. And Mattel was furious, said, "This is awful." DC insisted, and I can't remember much else we did for him there.
No, I think he was well, because at that point he was doing the comics, then we started doing the magazines, and we were also working on Kirby Unleashed, trying to get that out before the convention. So we were really pushed against the clock to try and finish that, because remember we used to sit. We did that on a IBM Ball typewriter that was at this place I worked at that they had. So we typeset the whole. We did. I mean, we typeset it. We color separated it. We picked everything. It was just like we hired the printer. And then, of course, we got shafted.
You did more of that than I did. You dealt with the printer and all those people.
But we it was pretty much 50-50 on that. I mean, we both consulted on, is this right? The whole package. And then once it came out and we started selling them, DC goes, well, you can't sell those because we hired Jack. And even though they didn't have a contract or anything, but, Jackie didn't want any problems. So they said, we'll sell them. So we had to ship them all to DC where they sold them. And so it was like a wash. We got back what they cost.
Yeah. All right.
Poor Jack.
The rest of these questions here. I think you left, he's talking about to me, right after Humanity #1 was published, right? But when did Steve officially stop working for Jack? I've always assumed it was when he went back to Marvel in late 1975.
Right. As soon as Cobra came out, I was done. As soon as Jack said Cobra came out and he showed it to me, and he was like, I'm leaving. I said, I don't blame you. I said, well, there's nothing for me to do. I can't go with you to Marvel, so bye-bye. Yeah. And I went into show business.
Yes, we're going to talk. I want to leave time to talk about the work you've done since then, Steve, and the amazing ways our paths have crossed while doing all that stuff. Let me go through the list here. Were you guys regularly working with and in contact with Mike Royer, and did he mostly just show up and to drop off and pick up work? Royer did it by mail. He almost never came out to Jack. That was from Whittier to Thousand Oaks was a pretty large drive.
Well, we would go out and visit Mike, and we would drive from the west side to Whittier, and it was a hell of a drive to go.
Yeah, it was about 45 minutes to an hour where Mike was. Remember when we went down to Mike, he'd have us stop at a KFC on the way there and pick up dinner. Yeah, but no, the first New Gods that Mike inked, I took home with me, and Mike had to come to my house to get it.
Mm-hmm.
And Jack said to me, go over it with him page by page and tell him how he should do every panel. And I didn't know what to do. I said, well, here is how you go over, and what you should do is you should ink this panel, then you should ink this panel, then you should ink this panel, and it came out fine.
Yeah.
Mike's people a great guy. Want to know, one of our great contributions to Jack was we helped him get a better inker. And not just a better inker, but more control over his own work.
Which is what he wanted.
Because it would otherwise it would disappear into the DC machine, as they called it. They called it that, and they thought that was a compliment. And Jack would use the same term in a derogatory manner, but he didn't get to see the lettering before it was published. He didn't get to see the inking usually.
Coloring, anything.
He didn't get to the coloring. He didn't get to see the covers. He didn't get to see what they did to the covers. He didn't get to see what they changed. We were the ones who told him that they were redrawing his Superman heads on the Jimmy Olsen book. We found that out from a fanzine before they'd ever told Jack. So, and finally he was able to put together a comic because Royer turned his work in to Jack, not to DC.
Right, Jack could look at it before.
Look at it.
Yeah.
And
nail it.
and he was proud that it didn't look like a DC comic.
Yeah.
Sal Harris and those guys were upset that it didn't look like a DC comic.
Yeah. Oh. Do you ever think, Mark, I've been thinking about this, do you think they wanted Jack just to get him out of Marvel, or do you think they really wanted him to come up with something?
I think they wanted him to come up with something that would destroy Marvel. I think the problem with New Gods for Mr. Miracle was they didn't put Marvel out of business.
Yeah.
The book sold decently, according to all the statistics I've got, which I've got in the book I'm working on. But he didn't... I think one thing they thought would happen was that all the Marvel readers would come over to DC and see how fabulous, Flash was and Green Lantern, and they'd all abandon Marvel for DC, which wasn't going to happen, especially at a time when Marvel was improving their distribution enormously, and when Marvel was undercutting DC with the 20-cent price versus 20-cent price versus 25 cents, which may have been the biggest business mistake in the history of comics. For DC to go to 25 cents when Marvel was 20.
Yeah. You wouldn't think.
That was suicidal.
And they were also coming out, that's when Conan came out. That's when a lot of stuff Marvel put out that was, grabbing people. So, you can't expect Jack to... Well, like he used to say, he said, I'm competing with myself. Yeah. He says, what can I do?
Because Marvel was publishing more Kirby stuff in reprints than DC was in new stuff.
Yeah.
And I think that DC, I think Carmine wanted to show he could steal Marvel's top guy away. I think that was just a power. And I think he thought, well, Jack will come up with some great book that will,
just blow us away.
The balance of power between the companies. And I think, though, that they were not willing to let Jack be Jack. Because, the first thing Saul Harrison said to us was why we want him to not look like Jack Kirby. You see, I've spent 50 years, since that's all it's been, meeting people who would say to me, oh, I love Jack's work, but only why can't an inker change his art style? Why can't another writer change the way he writes? Why can't, in other words, I love Jack Kirby, but I want him changed the way I want him.
Yeah.
And we learned that you couldn't do that. That Jack was so organic in what he did. I tell people, no, you couldn't have had somebody else come in and dialogue those books. You couldn't have given them to some inker who would have fixed all the stuff that you think should be fixed.
Right.
You had to take Jack at face value. He had to do it. He had to do it his way. And if Stan Lee had dialogued the New Gods, they would not have been the same comics with different words in the balloon. They would have been completely different comics, better or worse. He would never have done the terrible Turpin issue. We would never have done the Glory Boat issue at all. Those issues would never have been in there if he wasn't in complete control of the storylines. And and I am actually pleased, and I think you'll join me in this. I'm pleased by how little of us is in those comics.
Yeah. No, it's pure Kirby.
Do you have this, Steve? Do you have the same feeling I have, where I look at I have a shelf behind me, off camera in this shot, with all the reprints of all the New Gods. It's been reprinted over and over and over again. And I don't have them there because I wrote forwards in most of them. I have them there because the same way I have other things in this house to remind me of Jack. Artwork by Jack and pictures of Jack and things like that. And I remember when I look at them, I remember the guys at DC, the guys in the merchandising division saying no one will ever merchandise these characters. The guys there who said, why would anybody do a merchandise of Mr. Miracle? We've got Batman. And now there's a Mr. Miracle doll, and these characters are getting on TV. These characters are living. And New Gods, the first early issues of New Gods have now been printed like 9 times.
Oh, yeah.
Hardcovers.
Those fat hardcovers.
Exactly the way Jack wanted them to be someday.
Yeah.
Deluxe printing, good paper, good coloring. Well, better coloring.
Yeah.
And he said that they would do that. He said someday these comics will be in hardcover, and nobody believed him. They consider those failed books. Now they wish they had 100 issues of New Gods to reprint because it sells every time they reprint it. And I just look at that stuff, and it reminds me of how right Jack was so many times.
Yeah. Yeah, no, he had it. I mean, how could you fault the guy? He'd been at it his whole life. He knew exactly. He'd been a publisher. He knew what sold. He knew what the audience would read. He had an innate sense of what to do. These guys, trying to second guess him all the time. I mean, just the fact I used to think, maybe if he had done something else besides New Gods or Forever People, maybe that would. But then you go, but they're still printing it. They're making a movie out of it. So he was right all along. Yeah. What are you going to do?
And a lot of the books that they told him then they wanted that they thought were great to emulate, nobody cares about today.
No. No.
Anyway, let me see if I can finish our list here. We got a few more here.
Okay.
Did either of you have concerns about the Fourth World being too complex for fans to follow, or did you encourage Jack to stretch its scope even further?
No, we never gave him any advice on that I recall.
I think a couple of times we told him to slow down. He was putting in new characters too fast, but he said, Carmine wants this in.
Yeah, well, because he was putting stuff in there hoping that they would branch out into other books. He was ready to take any of those characters and put them in their own book. But
and he was also concerned that he had told Stan some of the ideas, and he was afraid if he didn't do them, get them in print first, Stan might remember some of them and do some of those ideas.
Sure. I mean, look at Thanos. I mean, that whole, that's dark side, and they beat him to the movies with that one. So, it's just like, he was right. People didn't believe it. They'll steal. They know they won't, Jack. They won't steal. Oh, yes, they will. Oh, yes, they will.
But even at the time, he was concerned. Remember, one of the first things he told us about was that idea of doing a book of Dracula, a black and white magazine or a color magazine. He wanted it to be in color. A magazine, not a comic book, of Dracula in different time periods. And he wasn't sure if he had told that idea to Stan or not. So he was pushing Carmine to put that book out before Marvel did. And they came up with the Dracula book before he did. So, and there was a couple of things like that.
Well, he was always trying to push the medium. He wanted to make it more than a trifle. It was, bubble gum was a penny, a candy bar is a nickel, a comic's a dime. But he wanted to go beyond that. I mean, he really wanted to go back to large size comics, 64 pages, a magazine in full color. And they wouldn't listen to him. He just wouldn't listen to him.
He kept looking at National Lampoon and saying, that's what a comic should look like.
Right. But, but DC was just, they just weren't in that business. They were in the Superman, Batman business, and they weren't going to vary at all. They weren't going to go off.
Okay, here's the last question that John sent me. We got more questions to talk about that. What was the most frustrating part of working with Jack? Likewise, what was the most rewarding part? You go first.
The rewarding part was being around him and talking with him and listening to him and exchanging ideas and listening to his ideas. The most frustrating part was seeing how frustrated he was with the people that he dealt with. That hurt. You felt you felt you had to protect him. And not that he needed it, but you just felt that he was such a great guy that they were treating him like this. You go like, how can you treat Jack Kirby like this? This is Jack Kirby, okay? He created the Marvel Universe. Leave him alone. Just let him do what he does, but they wouldn't, and then it was very frustrating to see that anytime he did something, they'd either change it or wreck it. I know when when in the Days of the Mob and Spirit World came out, he was just crushed. He was just like, oh man, look at this. They printed it on toilet paper. Just like, Jack, And what's so funny is that they canceled them, and then a couple months later, Godfather and The Exorcist come out, maybe a year later, but he was on the right track. He was on the right, they would have had something. But, their brains weren't geared for that. They were not great businessmen up there at DC, I have to say. I mean, they were lucky they had Superman and Batman that kept them afloat. Because anything else, they would have just...
Well, you kind of stole my answer to both questions. That's actually what I was going to say. It was frustrating seeing him be frustrated. Do you remember the day he told us that New Gods and Forever People were being, quote, suspended?
Yeah.
I never felt so sorry for a man in my life. He was gray. He had actually turned he was pale.
Yeah, he was so crushed.
Yeah.
Which unusual because Jack usually, he didn't get crushed like that over comics, over the magazines, because he knew the score. He knew, sometimes you win, sometimes you lose, but these were really special to him. He was really trying to upgrade the comics. And if you read those today, you can see that he did. I mean, the stories they're so rich, the characters and the writing, that you read them today and they still hold up. What more can you say? 50 years later, they still hold up. That's what makes them great, really.
That was I remember after Jack died, talking to Roz, she remembered that day so vividly because she thought that was the day their lives changed. He really took it hard because, he had all these wonderful plans, and he realized that he could not do any of them at DC.
No.
He was just dealing with this. And then there was that time, now maybe I'm going to jog your memory about this. There was a distributors convention, a big distributors convention at the Beverly Hills Hotel on Sunset. Carmine was going to come out for it, and he wanted to take Jack as his date. He had tickets for 2 there. Carmine could not get out of New York for some reason. I think there was a weather problem, actually. So he told Jack, you go, take Roz, tickets are under my name. So Roz had come down with a bad cold, so she couldn't go. So you and I drove out to Thousand Oaks. We picked Jack up. He was wearing a suit, a beautiful suit. He was dressed perfectly. And we drove him, you were driving, to the Beverly Hills Hotel. We dropped him off. We went over to my place and played cards and ate pizza until he called and said, I'm ready to go home, guys. And we went over, picked him up, and took him home. Now, on the way there, he was like this. It was all, I'm going to tell those guys how to do comics. I'm going to tell them what they should be doing. I'm going to tell them I'm going to tell them this. On the way back, it was like, nobody there cares about the comics. Nobody has any interest in this stuff. They didn't even know what they published. They didn't know who I was. When I told them I was work for Marvel, they went, Marvel, we've heard of that. They didn't even know what Marvel was, really. And he realized that he was working for a company that didn't care if they published a single comic book or not. Right. And that really did not have too much respect for anybody in their comic book division. And that night he predicted that Carmine wouldn't be there much longer. And Carmine was not there much longer.
No.
And it was very, that was another devastating night for him. But the contrast between the Kirby on the way there and the Kirby on the way home was striking.
Yeah. Poor Jack.
Yeah. But, he kind of won in the end. I mean, not
he did.
He won. But Steve, now here's the question. When you meet people who find out you knew Jack Kirby, that you work with Jack Kirby, what kind of reaction do you get from people in and out of comics?
They're full of questions. They want to know about. They want to know what was he like. That was, I think that's what was he like. What was he like? What was
okay?
Jack like?
So I meet you someplace and I say, "You work for Jack Kirby. What was he like? Tell me what you say."
He was wonderful. He was the greatest guy you'd ever want to meet. He was exactly who you would hope he would be. He was Jack Kirby. He loved comics. He would talk to you. He would ask you about you. You could ask him any question, and he would give you an answer. He loved people. He was tremendous. He was just a real down-to-earth guy. You'd love him. That's what I say.
And I tell them, if you went to Jack with an idea, he would always say, "That's a great idea. And how about doing this also?" And he would tell you something that made your idea better.
Oh, yeah.
And he'd build on it and build on it. And you think, wait a minute. Did I tell him this idea before and he's been thinking about it for weeks? No, he came up with it on the spot.
No, that's what happened with Cobra. Is I wrote that up. I brought it out to him. We were sitting at the kitchen table. He was looking at it. He was going like, or not. He was like, well, you know, he's going like, Corsican brothers. And I go, huh? He says, they're brothers. They're Corsican brothers. One good, one bad. Okay, I got it. See you next week. And I laughed, and he sat down and he did Cobra. You know, he just like that. He put the whole thing together.
Before that trip we took to New York, I'd spent maybe 50 hours sitting with Jack for various projects and things, even during the Marvel Mania days, hearing the history. And he told us a lot. And you spent a few less than me, but a lot. And he would tell us, I created this idea, I came up with this idea, I came up with this idea. And I had a little natural skepticism because I'd been far enough into show business to know a lot of people were telling me they were, you know, I met, in my lifetime, I think I met 6 different people who told me they ghost wrote Alan Sherman's records in the 60s. Okay? And so I was a little skeptical of all those, you know, I created this idea, even though I didn't get my proper credit for it. I created this. Okay. So when we went back to New York on that trip, up at DC, we met Dick Giordano, Julie Schwartz, Neil Adams, Murray Boltinoff, Murphy Anderson. I mean, just met all these people. And then next day at Marvel, we met John Romita and Herb Trimpe and John Verpoorten, and Bill Everett was up at the office that day. And at the convention, we spent time with Joe Sinnott, and I spent time with Don Heck, and we spent the day with Steve Ditko. And everybody was telling us, yeah, Jack came up with all this stuff. Jack invented this. Don Heck started saying to me, Jack had this idea, and he had this idea, and he had this idea. He said, I'd get stuck on an Iron Man story because Stan didn't give me much of a plot. So I'd call Jack. I didn't call Stan. He wouldn't help me. I'd call Jack, and Jack would give me the whole plot. I tell him one sentence, and he'd go, okay, he goes here, then he does this, and he does this, and this character comes in. And I suddenly realized that what Jack said was essentially true. He gave it off in a couple of details here and there because, you know, he had a tendency to tell us a story about Captain Marvel, you know, something had happened and we realize he means Captain America. Otherwise, the story's perfect.
Yeah. No.
But I don't know if you were there, but we were up at Marvel, and Bill Everett was there, and I went up to him and I said, Mr. Everett, my name is Mark Evanier. I'm Jack Kirby's assistant. And Bill Everett, who did not look like a huggy guy, hugged me and said, get that to Jack. Tell him he's the greatest guy who ever lived. Tell him he's brilliant. I love him. You know, and I was the recipient of all that secondhand love.
Yeah.
And you were the recipient of a lot of it.
Yeah. Yeah. You would get that.
Yeah.
People
and so when you meet people and they start asking you about Jack, what else do they ask you about him?
What else? Did he draw as fast as we've read that he drew? I go, yeah, he did. He was fast. He was very fast. Faster than he probably needed to be, but, you know, he was fast. What else did they say? Ask. Did he use any files to look at stuff? And I'd say very rarely did he look at stuff. It was all in his head. All in his head. He was just, he was a genius. Really, if you put a term on it, he was a genius at what he did. Pure and simple. I had a moment when I was looking at Jack one day, and I just this thought popped into my head, and it never left. I thought, Mark, you're never going to have the brilliance of this guy because nobody's going to have the brilliance of this guy.
but it might be possible to work that hard. I was impressed with how hard Jack worked, how many hours he put in.
Yeah.
Even when he knew that the pages were going to be, even though he knew they were going to redraw the Supermans, he drew the Supermans. And even though he knew Vince Colletta was going to ink and leave out half the backgrounds, he put in the backgrounds. And even when he knew that he was going to hate the coloring and hate the printing, he put all this detail in. And one time we said to him, "Why are you putting all that in? It's not going to print." He said, "It'll print when they print this on good paper in 20 years, deluxe volumes." And he was right again.
Yeah. No, he never shirked. He never gave less than 100%. He was, no matter what it was, he gave it his all.
Were you there? I told this story in one of these other webcasts
later
of when Jack was talking about the San Diego convention, third or fourth year, and he said, "The day's going to come when this convention is going to take over San Diego. It'll be our town, and it'll be where Hollywood comes every year to sell the movies they made last year and to find out what they're going to make next year." You were present when he said that, right?
Oh yeah, no, he said it more than once too.
Yeah,
I mean,
some
he was
people
always
doubt me on that, but I said no. If he actually said it, and he was right. We went to the first San Diego Con together. Let's go back to that for a minute.
Yeah,
because we were there the day Sheldorf brought 111 people to the Jack studio and imposed on their hospitality quite a bit that day. But Jack was sitting there telling these guys to do the convention, to make it about more than just comics. Because to Jack, comics were about more than just comics.
Yeah.
Remember he used to talk about how comics could be, there could be comics in movies and comics in TV and comics even in dance. There could be free-form dance, which takes the energy of comic books and puts it on a stage. And then we drove down on the day of the Saturday of the first San Diego Con in 1970. You picked me up at my house. I remember I was so running to get out of the house, I didn't notice my father's car was missing from the driveway because it had been stolen overnight. When I came back, there were police there.
Later.
But it was Gary, Bruce Simon, and me.
Yeah.
And we drove down to San Diego that morning very early. We got there about 10 a.m. at the U.S. Grant, and we spent the day at the convention. And there were like 300 people there, and we thought that was
amazing,
huge.
Yeah.
And we spent a lot of the time there with Mark Hannerfeld, who was there. Hannerfeld was like the official DC representative, only he wasn't.
No.
He was just in town. DC hadn't sent anybody out, but Hannerfeld had come down, and he announced that he was the DC representative. So he suddenly was doing a DC panel, previewing what DC was having coming out. And Mark's the guy who went back to New York afterwards and told everybody, "You got to come to this convention in San Diego next year." And he's the one who started the trend of people coming out. And Mary Screenis was there.
I remember
Mary that day.
Yeah.
And Shell was coming up to us every 20 minutes saying, "Have you heard from Jack and Roz? Have you heard from Jack and Roz? They're not here yet." And there were no cell phones in those days, so it's like, how can we hear from them? Who would they call?
We don't have a cell phone. It's not invented yet.
They don't have a cell phone. Who would they call? And finally, he was supposed to speak at 2 o'clock, and he arrived in plenty of time. And then they had, it wasn't even a hall. It was like the foyer. They'd set up a few chairs. Most people were going to sit on the floor, and they had set up on a landing. They had a drawing pad for Jack. Yeah. He was going to give a talk there in the hallway, basically. And Jack came up to me just before it was going to start, and he said, "I want you to introduce me and tell them that I've left Marvel for DC, because this is August of 1970. The new comics aren't out yet, and most people don't know yet that Jack has left Marvel. His Marvel's books are still coming out. And tell him I don't want to discuss that. I'm not going to discuss that. I'm just going to talk about the new books." And he'd give me a list of things to tell people. And at this point, I had never spoken to 200 people. I guess there were maybe 150 people, 200 people there, tops, maybe 100. And I, for some reason, got real nervous because, like, who was I? I had no credentials. I had to get up there and tell them who I was. You know?
Uh-huh.
So I'm standing on the one side saying, thinking to myself, well, okay, I'll say this, I'll say this. I was really nervous about it. And Shell goes up, okay, it's time to start, and Shell goes up to Jack and says, okay, Jack, I'll introduce you. And Jack says, Mark's going to introduce me. And so Shell turns to Mark Hannerfeld and says, get up there and introduce Jack. And Mark Hannerfeld goes up and introduces Jack. And I sit there going, oh, good, let him do it. Let him do it. And Jack got up, and you and I were in the front row. You and I was on the floor in the front row. And Jack had not long before told us the story of Victor Fox, the King of the Comics story, which was a wonderful story told in Jack's studio. He told that he did the Victor Fox imitation. He got up and did the pacing. It was a hysterically funny story that you and I laughed at. And Jack was up there and he was nervous. He was only speaking to 150 people who loved him or so. Yeah. But he was nervous and he was tense. And we were whispering back and forth a little bit. And I think I said to you, maybe we should get him to tell the Victor Fox story because it was such a great story. And you put up your hand, and Jack, without acting like he knew you, called on him and said, Mr. Kirby, would you tell us the story about Victor Fox? And Jack went, okay. And he tells the story terribly.
Yeah, he was so nervous.
He was so nervous, he just rushes through it, and it's like a non sequitur story.
Just wow.
Looking at each other. And then finally he drew some pictures which were not drawn up to Kirby standards. And I remember thinking how lucky we are we got to see Jack off stage. Because off stage he was 10 times as fascinating and interesting and funny.
No, he froze up in front of strangers. If he didn't know you, he was very stiff. So not stiff, but it didn't flow as easily. If you just sat with him one-on-one and just let him go, he was amazing. He was great. I mean, we used to take walks outside the house and go up the path because there were no homes past his, or there was one or two. And on Sunday nights, we'd go walking, and he'd just talk, and we'd talk over stuff. We'd talk about UFOs. We'd talk about outer space. We'd talk about this and that. And he would just, or he would talk about, comics, about not comic books, but about the people in comics, which was from the 40s and 50s, which was, remember Kugelmass?
Yes.
Kugelmass?
I remember him talking a lot about Nixon. He and I had a lot of discussions about Richard Watergate and all that stuff. And I remember talking about movies he loved a lot. And remember the time we brought out the projector in the movie, the Valley of the Guanji?
Valley of Guanji.
Yes.
Yes.
You had a 60mm print of it. So at that point, it was a novelty to watch a movie in your own home.
Oh, yeah. Well, remember the Betamax video recorder I had? We did that. Yeah. 4th of July, we did Captain Plunger. Neil Kirby had a towel around his neck, and he had the helmet left over from Spirit World that girl wore that was like some kind of magic hat. And he had that, and he ran around, and he ran into Jack's studio, and Jack was there, and he was like, Kirby, Kirby, and he jumped in the pool. Oh, those were fun.
Yeah. Remember when I got executed in the empty lot next door?
Oh, that picture. I love that picture. That is just so hysterically funny because it was like, all right, Steve, you're going to take the picture. Okay, Gary, you put on this hat. Jack had all of his old winter clothes in his closet from New York. So he put Gary in this big overcoat and this bowler hat. And then he got Barbara, his daughter, and he put her in a big coat and a bowler hat instead of red. He says, Mark, you're the victim. And you were like, huh? And he put a gag in your mouth and put you down. Now get on your knees. And then Jack got dressed up and he had this water pistol we painted black, and he was like, okay, take the pictures.
Yeah, I was being executed. It was a mob hit. I was being executed in a field. Yeah,
in a field.
We're in the days of the mob.
Comics, man. You could do it. You can do that stuff.
Anyway, you miss him as much as I do, don't you?
Oh, yeah, all the time. Whenever I see people talking about him or I see something on Facebook, it's Jack Kirby, I just kind of, sigh. I go, oh, that's the Jack I remember. It's just, he was so wonderful. And Roz, too. I miss her. She was quite a character. I mean, if it wasn't for Roz, there wouldn't have been a Jack because she made sure that, he was protected. Because left to his own devices, Jack would have, done anybody any favor. you could ask him for anything and he would do it. But Roz was there to make sure, you know, now Kirby, don't. But yeah, no, they were a great couple.
I put a line in my book, the first book I did about Jack, and I was a little antsy about putting it in because I thought people would misunderstand it. But I had the same experience with my parents. At one point, I thought to myself about my parents, I hope they die in the right order.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that about Jack and Roz.
Mm-hmm.
Jack would not have survived 10 minutes without Roz. Roz could survive for a little while without Jack. And I think she lived like 2 more years.
Yeah.
And she lived long enough to get in the spotlight a bit, to get some of his standing ovations, which she probably deserved all along.
Sure.
And
but she never pushed for it. She was always in the background.
I remember calling her. I was in New York. DC had reprinted New Gods for Our People, Mr. Miracle. For the first time, they were in black and white paperbacks. They were so timid about this. They put them out in black and white with bad, well, not bad, but inappropriate toning on them. And I was up in the DC offices, and Paul Levitz and Jeanette Kahn came in, and they said to me, these books are selling way above our expectations. We're going to do the series in black and white, and then we're going to wait a couple years and put it out in color. We should have put it out in color in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, would you mind if I called Roz Kirby and told her that? And she said, no, please call. So I called from, it called from Julia Schwartz's desk. And I called her up in Thousand Oaks, and I told her what they had said to me, and she started crying over the phone. And she was saying, Jack always said they'd be a hit. Jack always said they'd be a hit. And she died very soon after that.
Mm-hmm.
I was very glad I made that call, so she knew that.
Mm-hmm.
And that they had sold well enough, and they had proven to withstand, as we said, the test of time. They were just, I was so happy when they settled the stuff with Marvel. I was so happy when those books keep coming out and are proven to be as good and as enduring as we thought they were. I'm so happy when I see that Jack is getting way more credit than he ever has. He's well on his way to getting enough of it, but not quite there yet. But I keep being aware of people around show business a lot. I go into meetings and I'm amazed that people say to me, how much they love Jack, and tell us about Jack. You knew Jack Kirby,
I know, we're kind of like the last of the Mohicans, you knew Jack Kirby. Yes, we did.
There's a lot of people like that. I get that. You knew Bill Hanna and Joe Barbera. You knew Stan Freberg already. I'm getting that already. And Stan's only been around for 2 years. I was in a Costco in Tustin a few years ago. I used to have to drive when Carolyn was sick. I used to drive her down to a doctor in Tustin and leave her there. So I'd kill an hour and a half. I'd go to Costco and shop. The big Costco. So they had in the Costco, they were selling a CD of the first 10 issues of Fantastic Four, the first 10 issues of Spider-Man, the first 10 issues of Thor, the first 10 issues. It was like, 100 issues of Marvel Comics on a CD for like $4.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought, well, this might come in handy to have. So that's $4 at Costco, the same price as snow tires there. And I'm checking out with that and all the other stuff I bought. I've got the obligatory toilet paper. They won't let you out without toilet paper and paper towel. Well, maybe now they will, but they wouldn't then. And there's this Hispanic kid, 15, 16 years old, who is acting as kind of a box boy, bagging stuff or boxing it.
Mm-hmm.
And the CD goes down the conveyor belt to him, and he picks it up, he looks at it, and he sees it's got Jack Kirby drawings on the outside of the packaging. And he turns to me and he says, "These were drawn by Jack Kirby, the greatest comic artist who ever lived. Marvel fucked him over." I froze for a second, and I looked to see where my Costco card or my credit card were to see if the kid had seen my name and put them together.
Mm-hmm.
I thought he looked at that, he saw my name and went, "Oh, they knew something about." He hadn't. Mm-hmm. He was saying this to a total stranger. Who had no idea. Knew Jack Kirby.
Mm-hmm.
And I just stood there like, wow, people are getting on to this
There are other people who know Jack Kirby.
Yeah,
Me.
I've had a lot of. I've had that experience many times. I've
Yeah.
had that experience a number of times. I'm hesitant to leave the topic of Jack Kirby completely here, but we've been doing this for an hour and 25 minutes here, and I want to talk about what you've done since then, because I find it so remarkable. Tell the people what your main line of work has been. You were even getting into this while working for Jack in a while.
Yeah, well, I was always interested in puppetry, and well, my main interest was always film and animation, more so than comics. But after leaving Jack, I went to work for Filmation in production, which actually you were involved in that, because the guy who got me in there was the guy who was Seymour's producer, Gary Blair.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And he knew somebody at Filmation. And
Seymour was a horror movie host in Los Angeles. Larry Vincent, he was Seymour on Channel 9 and later on Channel 5 hosting horror movies. And I wrote stuff for him for a while. And we went down to the set and hung out with Seymour. And anyway.
And I met Gary Blair. And I was working on something with him. And it didn't work out. And so I said, well, I guess I'll have to find a job. And he said, what would you like? I said, I'd like to work at Animation. He said, I know somebody at Filmation. So the phone said, go to Filmation and talk to this guy. So I did. They gave me the animation test, which I failed because I can't draw that well. But they said, well, we got work in production. So I said, okay, that's fine. So for 2.5 years, I worked in the camera department and production and went all over the place learning all about animation, and got a union job and a union card. And it was great, because when they took the break during the summer, I had an income which was equal to what I would earn if I was working. So it was great. So I could, I think at that time, let's see, I think I was doing some stuff for Jack at the time too. I'm not sure. I do remember Carmine came through to talk about Superman, and I tried to talk him into doing Commandy as a cartoon, but he wouldn't even listen to me. He was like, I don't know you. Get away from me. But
I had the same experience with Saul Harrison at Ruby Spears when we were doing Plastic Man. He came out to supervise some of that and would barely talk to me. So, yeah. So
then for a while there, I worked freelance doing graphics. I went to work for a toy company as a business manager, just to earn money and get my own apartment. But I was still, trying to get into show business. But eventually, I went to work for Sid Marty Krofft. By the way, Sid's 91 this year.
Wow! I gotta call him.
He looks great. He looks great. So I went to work for Sid Marty Krofft as originally I was going to try to be a writer, to write material, but they needed puppeteers. They said, "We'll train you to be a puppeteer." I said, "I've always liked puppets. Sure, go ahead."
They didn't need writers because they had me.
Yes, they had you, and I forget who that other guy was.
Lorne Froman.
I didn't think highly.
Roby Gorin. Yeah.
Yeah, Roby. No, he was funny, but Lorne stuff, I don't know. But anyway, they let me. Once I became a puppeteer, they were thinking of this idea for the show that took place in Washington, D.C. So they put us in a room and had us bat around ideas for the show, which eventually became DC Follies, although stuff that we did never showed up in it. But anyway, I became a puppeteer.
Steve, the stuff I did for it never showed up in it.
But anyway, I went to work for Sid Marty Krofft. I worked on a bunch of shows for them. And I met a fellow puppeteer named Greg Williams. And we both liked to write. Greg had written for the Muppet books. And while we were at Sid Marty Krofft, the work started to dry up. So we said, well, let's go into business for ourselves. And so we did. And Sid and Marty were nice enough, when they got a job that was too small for them, they gave to us. So the first thing we did was this commercial with alien puppets. And after that, it took off. And for the past 30 years, I've been a puppeteer, and I worked on Mighty Joe Young, Men in Black 1 and 2, DC Follies, Beakman's World, Pee-wee's Playhouse, Riders in the Sky, bunch of commercials. And it's been great. We've had our own company called the Puppet Studio in North Hollywood. And for the last 13 years, we've been doing work for Princess Cruises, all their shows. all their live shows that have puppets or costumes that are, that the dancers wear that have animation in it and all that we've been doing. And now, as I'm 71 years old, I'm semi-retired. I still go in, but it gives me time to read all my old comics.
Now, what was very bizarre is you were working for the Crofts and I was working for the Crofts.
Yes.
Just by coincidence.
And we never met there.
Well, we met there. We met on the Barbara Mandrell show.
Oh,
I was helping out on that stuff over there. And you were working with, who was that lead puppeteer there?
Tony Urbano.
Tony Urbano. He and I did not get along that well, but he was a very brilliant puppeteer. He just did not like anybody who was a writer if they didn't work puppets. And I had worked puppets actually a little bit, so he kind of tolerated me.
Yeah.
But then we also got put together completely coincidentally on the ABC weekend specials.
Captain O.J. Reedmore.
You built O.J. Reedmore, and you and Greg operated the puppet, and I wrote the scripts.
You wrote the scripts.
And do you remember who we worked with on the guest stars we had on those shows?
Oh, we had Vincent Price. I remember we went to lunch with Vincent Price, and I was like, wow, this is Vincent Price. I wish I had known more about radio back then, because I would have asked him all these questions about the Saint. But, Billy D. Williams, Bowser.
John Bowman, yeah.
A magician.
Harry Blackstone
Jr.
Pat Morita.
Pat Morita, he was great.
Sherry Belafonte. Who else we have in that? We had a bunch of celebrities.
A bunch of ABC celebrities, yeah.
These were the wraparounds. O.J. Reedmore was a character. He's a cat who encouraged kids to read more. And so instead of reading, you would watch his show on television.
Cartoons. Yeah, bad cartoons.
But he hosted the wraparounds, intros and exits segments for the ABC weekend specials, and I was hired to write them. And Steve was doing the puppeteering with Greg, and
Frank Welker did the voice the first time around.
First season was Frank Welker. Second season was Neil Ross. They just decided to change OG's voice.
We did a lot. We did a lot of those. Yeah. There were plenty of them. We did like 2-3 seasons, I think.
I think we did 2. I think we did 2 seasons. I have them on DVD. I have all our stuff on DVD. If you want a copy of it.
Oh, I've got the I've got actually VHS tapes of it, but yeah.
Yeah, I did. I had 3/4. I transferred them to DVD. But I remember when we were doing them. Steve was in like a little hole. The set was built up.
And it was in a chair.
So he was sitting kind of below. So when OG wasn't in his chair, Steve's head would be poking out of it
through the back of the chair.
And we had OG in the chair, and Sherry Belafonte Harper was sitting next to OG. We were talking to her, and she starts stroking OG. She forgot he was a puppet, and she's like caressing him and just holding his hand and rubbing him and things like that. And Steve is looking up, going.
But that was great, because when she first came in, she was scared of it. She went like, "Oh, what's this creepy thing?" Yeah. And then within a few minutes after he started talking and moving, she forgot all about that and was like, "Oh."
Do you remember Frank Welker over lunch doing his Vincent Price impression for Vincent Price, and Vincent Price was teaching Frank how to make it sound more like it. Yeah. And they're going back and forth, and as they went, Frank started sounding more like Vincent Price, and Vincent started sounding less like Vincent Price. Yeah.
Yeah, that was great. That's
amazing stuff. And then the Mandrell show, I had left the Crofts for a while, and I took a job over at Sunset Gower, thinking, well, I'm going to get away from Sid and Marty for a while. I love them, but I need to work for somebody else. And I moved in there. I turned down working on the Mandrell show, and I moved into another show there, and suddenly they're moving in across the hall at Sunset Gower.
Yeah.
Marty's in my office every day saying, can you help us on this script and stuff? And that was a very strange. Everybody in our lives runs into everybody else.
Yeah,
it's kind of amazing.
It is. Well, it's a small town, really.
Anyway,
doing TV. Well, that's an hour and a half, Mark. I think we need to.
We're going to wrap this up here, Steve. It is great to see you again.
Always good to see you, Mark.
It is. We should see each other more often. This is the closest we can get right now during the pandemic. But
I know you can't get to the Magic Castle for lunch.
There's no Magic Castle.
There's no Magic Castle.
It's closed down. Actually, it's not that difficult to stay in my house because there's no place else to go. Nothing's open. There's no plays. There's no movies. There's nothing.
That's what I tell people. They say, is the is the quarantine bad on you? I go, no, I don't go anywhere. I stay here. I go to my office where Greg is, the studio, and it's just him and me. Or I come home. I go to the market. That's it. I'm not going to the rave. So I can keep this up for a long time.
Great. Well, Steve, thank you for doing this with us.
Thank you, Mark.
And, we will see you very soon, and we'll stay in touch.
Okay.
And thank you.
Take
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.